finally, we're going to bring back in the market, okay? And again, the market is consists of supply and demand, okay? And that's not, doesn't look like a P. There's a P. Okay, it's the prices, and it's got supply and demand. And when a market is in equilibrium, just like we explored before, the market will establish a price of P star for a product, and it will trade Q star units on the market. Now, using our boundedness conditions for consumer and producer surplus, remember producer surplus was bounded below by marginal cost, which is equivalent to supply. Okay, bounded above by the effective price the producer gets for the product, and bounded on the right by the quantity traded. In other words, this triangle here, this area here, is exactly producer surplus. Okay. Now, if we remember the boundedness conditions for consumer surplus, it was bounded above by marginal benefit, which is equivalent to demand. If I could only write, it'd be nice. Okay, which is equivalent to demand, bounded above by marginal benefit, which is equivalent to demand, bounded below by the effective price the consumer has to pay for the product, and bounded on the right by the quantity of the product the consumer consumes, which is the quantity traded of the product. Okay, so that area there is consumer surplus. Now, as I stated earlier, when all this started, the sum of consumer surplus plus producer surplus equals total surplus. Okay? Let me repeat that. The sum of producer and consumer surplus is total surplus. Okay? Now, we can see that this triangle cannot get any bigger. This total surplus triangle cannot get any bigger than it currently is, holding constant supply and demand. It's as big as it can be. You can already see how this is going to benefit us in measuring inefficiencies, because if I lop off a part of this triangle, for instance, okay, if I lop off a part of this triangle, I can now measure how much that triangle is missing relative to the entire triangle. So if that's 10% of the entire total surplus triangle, then the market is inefficient to the tune of 10%. Okay, you see where I'm going with this. Now I can actually measure how inefficient a market is. Okay, now I want to clarify something about total surplus here and the way economists think about it. Okay, let me give you three different situations. So I'm going to draw a market here. We've got supply, we've got demand, we've got price, we've got consumer surplus, we've got producer surplus. Okay, we got another situation. Okay, another scenario. We got supply that looks like this. We've got demand that looks like this. So relatively steep supply curve. That's consumer surplus. That's producer surplus. Okay, and down here we've got a situation with a relatively steep, or as remember before we said, inelastic demand curve, and supply curve is relatively flat, and so consumer surplus is this area here, and producer surplus is that area there. Okay, so let me ask you a question then. Which is better for society? Is it better to have equal amounts of surplus, relatively equal amounts, consumer and producer surplus? Is it better for consumer surplus to be smaller than producer surplus, or is it better for consumer surplus to be larger than producer surplus? Well, I think that if you ask 100 people, 95 of them at least would say that this is the preferred outcome, where consumer surplus far exceeds producer surplus. Okay, and the problem is, in the eyes of an economist, they would be incorrect, and here's why. In every single case, total surplus is maximized. It's as large as it can be in every single case. Okay? So an economist would not discern between any of these. We would only be interested in market efficiency. Is the market fully efficient? In other words, is total surplus maximized? And total surplus is maximized in every instance. Okay, in every instance, meaning that every market is fully efficient, regardless of the distribution of producer and consumer surplus. The reason is because economists see, many people are brought up to think that corporations are evil people, that firms are simply evil. We're raised to think that it's an us against them sort of concept. But think about it. Think about how odd that sounds. We get consumer surplus from what? From the consumption of a good. How do we consume a good? Well, we have to buy it first. Well, how do we buy it? Well, we have to make a paycheck first. Who do we get that paycheck from? Firms. Okay? So our consumer surplus is a direct result of firms giving us jobs. On the flip side, how does producer surplus get to be a producer surplus? Well, they have to sell a good. How do they sell a good? Well, they have to find consumers. Well, then what do the consumers have to do? Consumers have to purchase that good. Okay? So firms don't have producer surplus without consumers purchasing their product. Okay? In other words, firms and consumers are equal fixtures in society. So when society's total surplus is maximized, society is fully efficient, society is happiest, and that includes both consumers and firms. Doesn't matter the distribution of consumer producer surplus. An economist is happy as long as total surplus is maximized.